I'm particularly happy to introduce our last speaker for today, Jesse McCarthy, who is Associate Professor of English and of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. Last April, Jesse published with the University of Chicago Press The Blue Period, Black Writing in the Early Cold War. He also published a collection of essays in 2021, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul, where he gathered many of his contributions to magazines like The Nation, Dissent, or the Los Angeles Review of Books. And Jesse is the author of a novel, The Fugitivities, published by Melville House in 2021. Jesse edited The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois for the Norton Library and co-edited the first volume of the African American Poetry Anthology, Minor Notes for Penguin Classics, 2023. And on a quick and more personal note, I had the privilege of meeting Jesse when he was a graduate student at Princeton, where I taught for a semester in 2012. And years later, as the co-editor of Transposition, which is a French journal, I had the immense pleasure of publishing a brilliant article that Jesse wrote on Proust, listening, and the telephone. So the title of Jesse's talk is Toward a Theory of the Black Superaddressee. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, of course, Peter, for bringing me back. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. And I'm excited to go after these incredible talks that we've just had. And it's fascinating because I think there's so much in conversation with each other. And it's just the beginning of what's clearly going to be a really remarkable conference. And thank you, Peter, for putting it together. Ben and everyone else here at the Kogut Institute for bringing me. As the title of this talk suggests, the word "toward" is sort of something that we drop in to signal that work is still in progress, and this is work that's still in progress. So I apologize for its slightly chaotic form, especially towards the end. But I really wanted to be a part of this, and I wanted to make sure I put something together specifically for it. I'm going to fly under the flag here of an epigraph from Mikhail Bakhtin. The quote is, "For a human being, there is nothing more terrible than a lack of response." And I chose this epigraph because it comes from the essay that we'll called The Problem of the Text, where Bakhtin will bring up this notion of this concept of the superaddressee that I'm kind of riffing on. But also I intend for it to have a political and, if you like, a geopolitical resonance. It's my note that I want to have in the air. So I'll begin my remarks today with a passage that caught my attention as I was reflecting on the question that Peter Sendy posed to us for this symposium, Who Do We Read For? It occurs in a novel called Great Expectations that was published this year, 2024, by the writer Vincent Cunningham. The narrator of Cunningham's novel is a young Black American who is working on the campaign of an unnamed candidate who was running for president in 2008. And the novel plays on its status as a roman à clef, exploiting a popular mode of contemporary autofiction while withholding direct or explicit correlation just enough to allow the narrative to function allegorically rather than pruriently. Cunningham's novel, it seems to me, seeks to capitalize on what it presumes, probably rightly, is the reader's interest in celebrity and tabloid curiosity. And Vincent Cunningham, I could say, worked on Obama's campaign. But it seeks to capitalize on this, but then repeatedly deflects attention away from an insider's view into a famous political figure and a historic American presidential campaign, and diverts it instead towards a series of questions about the relationship of a community, specifically Black Americans, to ideas of destiny and deliverance, leadership in a political, but even more so in a religious or messianic sense, and the ways in which these narratives, the titular Great Expectations, end up failing to resonate with a narrator whose progress throughout the novel is one towards disillusionment, alienation, and disenchantment, even as the candidate he's working for marches ever closer to triumph and success in his goal of achieving high elected office. At one point, Cunningham's narrator, David, is sent on a fundraising mission to Martha's Vineyard, an island off Cape Cod known for harboring a wealthy enclave that is historically associated with liberal elites and specifically relevant in this context with the Black American upper class. To get to the island, David must take a ferry out across the Atlantic waters that separate it from the mainland, and this occasions a digressive reminiscence with a distinctly literary content. I once had a teacher who insisted that whenever water is mentioned in a Black book, that is, in a book written by a Black person about Black people and the fact of their Blackness specifically, we are meant to think of the passage of African slaves of the Atlantic. Water, for us, she would say, is a reminder and a symbol of trauma, wherever it may be found, flowing from a faucet, pooled in a gutter, pouring from the sky, or, as I saw it that summer, from the window of a ferry to a fundraiser on Martha's Vineyard, spread out endlessly like a rippled blue floor. David tells us that his teacher, though employed as an academic at the City University of New York, quote, was herself a novelist. So we are to understand that this lesson is not only about how she teaches, but how she reads a Black literary tradition. And the implication that Cunningham foregrounds by emphasizing her deictics, for us, is that there is a readerly response expected or embedded in this relationality. That in some sense, Black readers read for the implied historical experience of a contiguous community of readers connected by a metaphor of oceanic depth that stands, at least in part, for the suffering of the Middle Passage as the Bakhtinian chronotope of Blackness. What is clear about David's response to his teacher's lesson, and that surfaces almost symptomatically in his choice of simile at the end of this passage, is a rejection of that relational equation. For him, the ocean is not a space of depth and connection to history. It is a floor, a flat, traversable distance that is separating him only from the next stop on a fundraising tour that is supposed to advance both his own career and that of the politician he's working for. Now, this is not simply a passing reflection by our narrator. The implications of his rejection are expanded upon, and the novel takes time to dwell upon them, including what seem to be a set of gendered readings that come into view as David recalls that this was specifically a course on Black women writers. Now that I think of it, this notion, water as invariable echo of ancestral pain, was what held her entire course on Black women writers together. There was always water, and the more it appeared, the better and more animatedly she taught. David's dismissive attitude towards his teacher becomes connected in this moment to a broader judgment of a Black writerly mode, one that for him is emblematized by Black women's writings from a period strongly associated with the rise of Black feminist thought as a public discourse. In keeping with the Romana Clay conventions that the novel adheres to, David singles out one novel in particular for scorn, but withholds the title and the author's name. Yet he gives us more than enough plot description to make it unambiguously certain that he is talking about Polly Marshall's 1983 novel, Praise Song for the Widow. The contortions of allusion and reference that this indictment induce are quite interesting to contemplate. David, the Black narrator of a novel about the campaign for the first Black president of the United States, is distancing himself from a Black literary trope by rejecting a set of Black literary antecedents, but by relying on a specialized knowledge of a Black literary history that his reader needs to have to fully comprehend the very gesture being elaborately performed. The intrusion of this complicated figuration fits well within what we now familiarly call, via Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s theory of the signifying monkey, an instance of signifying, a call and response between texts, often ironic and often reflexive, that indexes or marks their Blackness not by virtue of racial belonging, but through rhetorical performance and mutual recognition. But where for Gates, signifying is an act of rhetorical filiation and genealogical relation, David's version in Great Expectations signals the narrator's desire to break from that very model, to sever the umbilical cord to his Black literary foremothers and to the matrix of a compact between Black readers and Black writers, going back, whether literally or metaphorically, to the Middle Passage. This is still from the novel. Sometimes I laugh when I think of that teacher and that book, because although I have been taught and have sometimes almost accidentally taught myself so many symbol structures like this one, and have come in some ways to love and depend on them, creaky explanatory crutches that they are, I have some trouble taking them seriously. So as the ferry sped across the water toward the vineyard, I remembered the Middle Passage thing, but couldn't feel it. No metaphor, no bodies, no voices, nothing. Just an illegible motion away from the city and the occasional smell of salt and sound of birds. I am, of course, interested in that word illegible in the last sentence, appended to a preceding series of emphatic negations. It is as if the end of history, more here in Francis Fukuyama's sense than even Hegel's, is the end of reading, or at least the end of reading for those metaphors, for those bodies, for those voices. David's post-historical Blackness has an illegible motion that is no longer teleological, no longer moving forward in an arc of progress, nor backwards to recover ancestral memory. It advances only in the flat time of social advancement, the next appointment, the next fundraiser, the next election, a series of events to which the reading of literature, any literature, but certainly any Black literature by women, can make no difference. A future, or really a present, in which literature is already an unnecessary and almost embarrassing heirloom. Or at least that is what David seems to think. The novel as a whole seems to side with him, but remains uncertain, doubtful. Cunningham closes this, I'm sorry, I've moved too fast. Cunningham closes this long digressive passage across the waters to Martha's Vineyard with the sentence, "Just as the boat reached the pier, it began to rain. Thin, sizzling drops troubled the water, but only slightly. The water metaphor that has just been expounded upon must be contained, diffused, deactivated per David's perorations, and yet troublesome as ever, the water at the pier helplessly carries biblical overtones, as well as its more popular infusions in American song, like Bridge Over Troubled Water, music that is rooted in gospel and ultimately in the African-American lineage of the spirituals." Stepping back for a moment, we could consider reading this through the lens of authorial strategy. Great Expectations is a debut novel, after all, and on one account, what is going on in this passage might be understood through the lens of the racial unfamiliar, a phrase that John Brooks has suggested in a recent book of the same title, that Brooks applies to a wide range of Black writers and artists, including Kara Walker's famous Cutouts and novels like Percival Everett's James, that deliberately and strategically confound or manipulate racial stereotype in order to produce a destabilizing or defamiliarizing awareness of those stereotypes' enduring presence and potency. But I want to extend the reach of this moment of intertextual reading to suggest another possibility that it seems to me fruitful to apply to the question of Black literature more generally. In a late essay called The Problem of the Text, Mikhail Bakhtin introduces the concept of what he calls the superaddressee, for what he describes as a third or higher addressee that inserts itself into the dialogical structure of novelistic form. And here's the relevant passage in that essay. But in addition to this addressee, the second party, the author of the utterance with a greater or lesser awareness always presupposes a higher superaddressee, third, whose absolutely just responsive understanding is presumed, either in some metaphysical distance or in distant historical time, the loophole addressee. In various ages and with various understandings of the world, the superaddressee and his ideally true responsive understanding assume various ideological expressions: God, absolute truth, the court of dispassionate human conscience, the people, the court of history, science, and so forth. In a gloss of this passage, the editor Michael Holquist explains that, quote, poets who feel misunderstood in their lifetimes, martyrs for lost political causes, quite ordinary people caught in lives of quiet desperation, all have been correct to hope that outside the tyranny of the present, there is a possible addressee who will understand them. The figure of the superaddressee has, I think, an obvious appeal and resonance for the literature of a people whose entrance into the literary canon under modernity takes place first and foremost under the sign of the slave narrative and the abolitionist tract. One of the earliest of these, Otoba Cugoano's Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil of Slavery, ends on a thundering Jeremiad that also, interestingly, and I'm interested in sort of this part of it, contemplates the possibility of its own futility. And this is Cugoano. And though many things which I have written may seem harsh, it cannot be otherwise evaded when such horrible iniquity is transacted. And though to some what I have said may appear as the rattling leaves of autumn, that may soon be blown away and whirled in a vortex where few can hear and know, I must yet say, although it is not for me to determine the manner, that the voice of our complaint implies a vengeance because of the great iniquity that you have done, and because of the cruel injustice done unto us Africans. And it ought to sound in your ears as the rolling waves around your circumambient shores. And if it is not hearkened unto, it may yet arise with a louder voice as the rolling thunder, and it may increase the force of its volubility, not only to shake the leaves of the most stout in heart, but to rend the mountains before them, and to cleave in pieces the rocks under them, and to go on with fury to smite the stoutest oaks in the forest, and even to make that which is strong and wherein you think that your strength lieth, to become as stubble, and the fibers of rotten wood that will do you no good, and your trust in it will become a snare of infatuation to you. Cugoano foresaw correctly, it would turn out, that his words would fall on deaf ears. His treatise was entirely neglected in his own time, as the abolitionists who sponsored it were terrified of its unmitigated, wrathful rhetoric and by any means necessary implications, and threw all of their weight behind his comrade, Olada Equiano, whose text eschewed Jeremiad in favor of an interesting narrative of Christian redemption, and which remains to this day the preferred text for those teaching the history of Black British abolition and the rise of the slave narrative. But I'm especially interested in how Cugoano's autumnal leaves echo and presage the conclusion of another famous text in the tradition, Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, which a little over a century later makes its epilogue explicitly, I think, to a superaddressee who knows how to read what his contemporaries cannot or will not hear. Hear my cry, O God the reader. Vouchsafe that this my book fall not stillborn into the world wilderness. Let there spring, gentle one, from out its leaves vigor of thought and thoughtful deed to reap the harvest wonderful. Let the ears of a guilty people tingle with truth, and 70 million sigh for the righteousness which exalteth nations. In this drear day, when human brotherhood is mockery and a snare. Thus, in thy good time, may infinite reason turn the tangle straight, and these crooked marks on a fragile leaf be not indeed the end. These texts leave, these book leaves that tremble at their author's uncertain endings, that warn of snares, that are steeped in biblical appeal to a transcendent authority, in Cugoano's case through allusion to Isaiah 64. Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down, that the mountains would tremble before you. And in Du Bois to Proverbs 14:34, righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. In a sense, I think make the case for the Black superaddressee almost unavoidably by explicitly interjecting within the address to the worldly reader, the address to a reader with a capital R, who will justify the labors and pains of their writerly undertakings. But I want in these reflections to pursue a more difficult notion, one that takes the concept of the superaddressee but shifts it from a divine or ultimate reader outside of time and history and into the notion of a readership still in the world, but located in the future vis-a-vis the text. In particular, I'm interested in the kind of communitarian appeal that Stephen Best has argued is everywhere either an implicit or explicit premise of contemporary Black studies, precisely the kind of claim Cunningham's narrator David has in mind when he cites his teacher's use of the phrase "for us" when speaking about Black literature. For me, Stephen Best's most recent book, None Like Us, Blackness, Belonging, and Aesthetic Life, which was published in 2018, offers the most searching investigation of this thorny question. And because his own thinking is so crucial to my own in this matter, I'm going to have to quote him at some length, and by some length, I mean really at some length. It's poor etiquette on my part, but this is what it is. It's a work in progress. Best takes the title of his book from yet another radical Black abolitionist text, David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World from 1829, specifically from the following quote. This is Walker. I pray God that none like us ever may live again until time shall be no more. And here is Stephen Best's commentary on that single line. So I'm here entirely quoting Best. Walker's None Like Us bears a set of alternatives that it also liquidates in the manner of litotes or antinantiosis, implying a meaning by denying its semantic opposite. These alternatives constitute a we in the very moment of marking its apparent impossibility. I note 3. 1. First, there is an impulse toward the minor in Walker's attempt to constitute the collective. Why not pray that none like them shall ever live again, the most degraded, wretched, and abject set of beings? What is it about us, as we are right now, that prompts this prayer that none like us ever may live again? A prayer that must also be understood as an invocation of an absolute right to life? Is there a situation in which we could consolidate self-extinction and the right to life, such perfectly contradictory impulses? 2. I sense as well an opposing drive toward the universal in Walker's turn of phrase. Perhaps the term us is not so easily interpreted as Black people. Perhaps there is an assumed and impossible universality to Walker's us. If that is so, the challenge of discerning the collective nominated by the term us presents a problem of interpretation all its own. 3. All the same, I feel the prick of a personal address, every time I read the opening lines to Walker's appeal. When I read his prayer that none like us may ever live again, I find it impossible to avoid a sense that he is praying that one like me might never have lived at all. Can our disappearance from history preserve me? Is that, as the phrase goes, my condition of possibility? Or does that disappearance also constitute another continual advent given in the refusal rather than the achievement of the self? These tensions belie resolution, yet the myriad concerns I wish to take up in this book converge in the grammatical complexities of Walker's prayer, in his fraught semantic attempt to constitute a collective first person. My concern for the ethics of history written against the consequences of slavery, the articulation of blackness and belonging, the involution of rhetoric and identity. Walker's None Like Us cannot be read as simple affirmation or negation, an expression of belonging or alienation. Rather, the very condition of possibility, the origin of that us, renders it impossible. In his grammar, I hear the difficulty, pathos, desire, anguish, and frustration entailed in the effort to constitute the we of blackness. Black collective being finds itself acknowledged and refused in the same rhetorical act. What is more, in the very moment that Walker prays a Black people, a we, and to being, he leaves us in serious doubt as to whether that we can exist in history. The implication is not that Black people have been excluded from history, although that will be a concern in what follows. Rather, their very Blackness derives from bearing a negative relation to it. None Like Us, the book, finds purpose in sitting with this imponderable. And I apologize for the very long extract, but as you can see, I think it's very rich. And I too find it's an imponderable I'm still grappling with myself. Let me say at the outset that I think one of the strengths of Stephen Best's line of inquiry here is that he attempts to move us toward understanding the perennial problem of collective identity under the sign of Blackness, not from a place of affirmation or from one of the many sources he might have turned to that complacently assert such a community, sometimes the proverbial Black community, right? Rather than encounter, or even, as academics like to say, enact it. Instead, he takes a canonical text from the tradition, but sets as the foundation stone an expression, a phrase that he rightly construes as constituting an aporia, an impasse, holding any final meaning in suspense rather than an end stop that confirms and encloses an idea. Best is concerned that the field of Black studies is at present belabored by what he calls a melancholic historicism. And he identifies Toni Morrison's novel Beloved as, quote, the paradigm for this model of historiography, one that is necessarily literary because, quote, narrative and the act of reading together sustain the feeling of loss. It is a feeling, Best writes, that literature produces, not history, because literary texts, as intentional objects, possess silences and ellipses that are structural, whereas silence in non-literary discourse is not always the sign of an intention. The idea here is that we are turning to literature and fiction to repair the silences of an archive that we feel bound to suture as an ethical act of remembrance that simultaneously confers, and affirms our identity. The model for this is, of course, Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation, as she articulates it in her important essay, Venus in Two Acts, and performs it in her other major writings, including Lose Your Mother, and especially Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. Now, I don't want to intervene to adjudicate what I think is a powerful debate between two leading scholars about the nature of historicism and its claims upon Blackness. But I'm interested in thinking more about how the fictional invention or production of imagined truth works in relation to us as readers, who might be said to read for something that is at stake in this debate. Clearly, a great deal hinges then on how to understand what is going on in Morrison's Beloved at the level of address. One place that is traditionally focused upon is the famous refrain of the last chapter, or if you like, the last section of Beloved. Famous quote, "This is not a story to pass on." Now, Best reads this sentence as, quote, a trope of negation, paralepsis, or occultatio, one that is, quote, common to a poetics of revelation, one that recalls God's promise to Moses of a shielded revelation in the book of Exodus. That's Stephen Best. I agree with this, or at least up to a point, but I suppose the question for me is, to whom or for whom is the paralepsis intended? Best doesn't mention in his gloss of that sentence that the refrain is in fact slightly modified. Let's pull up, these are the relevant pages, and you'll see here, right, that the refrain appears 3 times here and then 2 more times before this is the very ending of the book. These are the very last pages. Now I've lost. And so we have here a refrain that recurs 3 times in the last section of the novel, but the first and the second time, the sentence is in the past tense and leads with the pronoun it. It was not a story to pass on. This is important because grammatically the first 2 occurrences, though set off from the prose paragraphs, are logically related to them as extensions of the possessive case. The story, these 2 first iterations say, belongs to them. It's their story, right? Them being the community in and around 124 Bluestone Lane. But they choose, and the paralepsis and repetition draws attention to the fact that they continue to choose not to pass it on. But what about the third iteration, which is also now a variation, right? The one Best quotes, and the one that he relates to God's promise to Moses. This is not a story to pass on. Now, the determiner this muddles the possessive we were expecting in its position. And the use of the present tense likewise applies a torque to the sentence that removes it from the narrational continuity, rendering it effectively extradiegetic. Who does this story belong to? Who is the subject that can be the addressee of this sentence? And here, I'm glad that Tiffany Buse is here because I'm in part, thanks to reading Free and Direct, thinking of this particular sentence, this very, very famous sentence, in terms of a phrase he helpfully gives us, that it's a moment of collapse of narrative standpoint, Buse's phrase, right? A collapse of narrative standpoint. And in another sense, we might also think here about what we've heard earlier today from Leah Price about the idea of kind of a proxy reading, in the sense, in part, that this is a kind of injunction or a piece of advice about reading and what to read or not to read. It's as if, in some sense, I think here in Buse's terms, there's a kind of way in which that sentence is ventriloquizing something like a novelistic form itself, right? It's a moment when the novel could be said, in a sense, to be thinking. And I'm also prompted to think from the earlier talk by Emily about, and you brought up this, my favorite essay by Barbara Johnson, but it's absolutely right, I think, also to bring in apostrophe here and to think about its connection, as she so helpfully brings it into view for us, its connection to the fraught question of legal personhood, which is, of course, all over a novel like Beloved. My argument, of course, would be that this third famous sentence is best understood as an example, perhaps even given the importance of the novel, as a kind of locus classicus of the Black superaddressee. And this view leads me to a slightly different reading than the one Best arrives at. Because in my own conception, the superaddressee is not passing a verdict down from outside of history, or a place of final judgment at the end of time. She is not a giver of divine laws or revealed truth shielded from unworthy eyes. That's his allusion right to Exodus. She merely presents an ethical instruction informed by the contents of the narrative up to this point. She is a reader who makes an assessment about what she has read. That is all. And that reader, or super reader, if you like, reads, I think, for an us, for a first-person plural that contains, as Best lays it out, all the contradictions of David Walker's None Like Us, its minor status, its universal aspiration, but also its capacity to function for a community of readers who understand themselves as personally addressed by it. To continue a bit with Beloved, the last sentence of the novel is actually a single word sentence, right? Beloved, which is also, of course, the title. And like the preceding refrains, is set off from the narrative paragraphs. In its isolation or fragmentation, it makes a last residual claim that cannot seem to be endorsed. One page earlier in the novel, the narrator says, although she has a claim, you see it here, although she has a claim, she is not claimed. This is worth thinking about in connection to what is often referred to as Beloved's chapter. And this is another famous portion of the novel that comes earlier, about midway, when the novel momentarily invests itself formally in the language of the titular ghostly revenant, who it has been argued is either the ghost of Setha's infanticide or an escapee from the Middle Passage itself. Morrison herself has suggested that the voice who speaks in this passage is both, and that there is a logic to that conjunction. Indeed, Morrison has described this section of the novel as, quote, a threnody, in which they exchange thoughts like a dialogue, or a three-way conversation, but unspoken, I mean unuttered. That three-way conversation is a result of the fact that, as Namwali Serpell observes in a forthcoming study of Morrison's novels, quote, though they do not hear one another's voices, we as readers do get to read their unspeakable thoughts unspoken. And here Serpell is quoting another famous quote from within the novel. Those unspeakable thoughts unspoken, to connect them, to realize that, as Morrison says, the language of both experiences, both of death and the Middle Passage, are the same. There's kind of palimpsest of language there. My argument would be that Morrison is invoking the Black superaddressee as reader, so that we as readers are pressed into the role of claimants, if you will, on Beloved's behalf. Only in the act of reading can the meaning of the text be, if not redeemed, at least held together temporarily on the same page. As Serpell notes, only a literary text can hold these contradictions and ellipses together. Only the Bakhtinian dialogical structure of the novel can accommodate the co-presence of these ontologies and temporalities. In other words, the novel can achieve formally what the Jeremiad in Cugoano, or the abolitionist essay in Walker, or the lyrical envoy in Du Bois cannot. It has incorporated the function of the superaddressee, but also metabolized it, taking up a readerly requirement, a desire among Black readers for an affirmation of Blackness as lisible, by producing instead new writerly or scriptible forms, to borrow Roland Barthes' terminology, for a distinction between the readerly and writerly functions and affordances of a text. As Barthes will say in The Pleasure of the Text, the language is redistributed. Indeed, Barthes' description of an experimental modern prose, and his example is Philippe Soler's novel Loi, published in 1972, is superbly evocative of Beloved's chapter. Le texte n'a plus la phrase pour modèle. C'est souvent un jet puissant de mots, un ruban d'infralangue. The text no longer has the sentence for its model. Often it is a powerful gush of words, a ribbon of infra-language. That ribbon, catching the infrared spectrum of a redistributed language, an ordinary language cut into by the shredder of the extraordinary and unspeakable violence of slavery, is the subtext of the melancholy historicism that Blackness, according to the view Best is critiquing, is haunted by. It is a synchronic claim, if you will, a synchronic relation. In the same beloved chapter with its fragmented and marooned phrases, jumping ahead here. Yeah, we can hear it, we can see them here. In the same beloved chapter with its fragmented and marooned phrases, we read the following, all of it is now. It is always now. There will never be a time when I am not crouching and watching others who are crouching too. In Joycean terms, history is the nightmare from which beloved cannot awake. The question is, does her overbearing present entrap our own? How is her address to be received if we, as superaddressee, are the implied readers her stranded language is waiting for? But I wonder too if I'm not overhearing something else. Is it possible that Morrison has embedded in this line an allusion to Dante? A fitting parallel if one is thinking about the experience of traveling through hell, right? Of being a mover in the kingdom of death, as beloved surely is. In Paradiso, Canto 17, we read, Così vedi le cose contingenti, anzi che siano in sé, mirando il punto a cui tutti I tempi son presenti. In Longfellow's, so thou beholdest the contingent things, ere in themselves they are, fixing thine eyes upon the point in which all times are present. These words are Cacciaguida's. Significantly, he is one of Dante's ancestors. These are words of reassurance to the pilgrim that even in his mortal state, he can see some things not under the sign of contingency, but as they really are, taken under the sign of eternity, sub speciae eternitatis, as Spinoza will later say. But here, literally, at the point where all the times or temporalities are present. In other words, all of it is now. But that point of perspective, that point at which all the times are now, still has to be delivered, mediated, addressed. And in Dante, and I think for Morrison, by an ancestor, by someone for whom the fate of the future will always have mattered, regardless of their ability to change it. Dante cannot avoid the prophecy of his melancholy exile from Florence. The Black reader cannot avoid the melancholy truth that his ancestry will always have been shaped by the past history of enslavement. But what matters, what the literary mediation enjoins, is not a fealty to the past, but a reading, and I would argue even a rereading, of the past in light of a more clear-eyed, searching present, the present of the pilgrim who asks questions of his ancestors because literature as a guide, like Virgil at one side, makes the asking possible. Beloved is the last word. Beloved has the last word, but we feel, we know that it is only one word in a never-ending dialogue, an open or infinite conversation in Maurice Blanchot's elegant phrasing. This is possible because her word is addressed not solely to the reader in that instance or to any character in her own fictional world, but because it is in open conversation through the figure of the Black superaddressee, who establishes a rhetorical relation to the collective aspiration of all readers, past, present, and yet to come, who are interpolated by this language used specifically in this way. They are the sum of all readers and everyone those readers have read for, all those who would or will become visible at the point where, as Cacciaguida says, all the times are present. If we return to the contemporary Black novel, we can find, I think, it's my argument, that we can find this superaddressee function subtly worked into new form. Consider how Raven Leilani in her novel Luster from 2020 introduces her own nod to the middle passage chronotope. Leilani's protagonist Edie is a young, struggling painter who we follow at one point as she is going into Manhattan to seek out her lover, who works as an archivist in a city library. Tellingly, she gets lost and ends up in the wrong library, but this error, or errancy, allows for a contingent encounter with a special exhibition that makes an important impression on her. And this is from Lester. There is a Nubian drawing of a man, and though the drawing has no perspective, the color of the water around him is carefully preserved. And I think about that resilience of that single pigment, the lapis lazuli traversing time. The flatness or lack of perspective distantly echoes Cunningham's rippled blue floor. But here, the color of the water, perhaps its luster, is a force of resilience that negates the passage of time, that allows momentarily for beloveds all of it is now. The focus is on the pigment of the blue water rather than on the blackness of the man. In Leilani's version, the color and question of resilience, perhaps even survival, a word that is important to the novel, is in a sense more important than even race. And yet the image Edie lands upon still implicitly connects the two, if only obliquely. And we can imagine Cunningham's fictional teacher being like, "I told you so." Right? Why go literally out of her way, as Leilani has Edie do in this scene, for no other purpose than to include this tangential observation, this ekphrastic detail? Is it not best explained by the novel's awareness of a superaddressee that it must find its own way to address, to speak to? Or take that famous interrogation at the end of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man that has stumped so many readers over the years. And that famous line is, "Who knows but that on the lower frequencies I speak for you?" In countless critical interpretations, Ellison is chided for supposedly addressing this rhetorical question to his white readers. But doesn't understanding it as his closing address to the black superaddressee seem more plausible? Isn't there a black reader that lies in the future of the novel's publication who will need whatever it is this question prompts? And what about those searching lines that Ellison's narrator muses over that are inspired by the Zoot Suit Boys he encounters on a famous scene on the subway platform on his way up to Harlem earlier in the novel? And this is that scene. "They'd been there all along." This is the narrator speaking. "They'd been there all along, but somehow I'd missed them. I'd missed them even when my work had been most successful. They were outside the groove of history, and it was my job to get them in, all of them. I moved with the crowd, the sweat pouring off me, listening to the grinding roar of traffic, the growing sound of a record shop loudspeaker blaring a languid blues. I stopped. Was this all that would be recorded?" That last interrogation surely has a third addressee, does it not? Isn't the recorder of all that has fallen out of the groove the very people, the folk, if you want to use Du Bois's term, that are not recording the world but reading it, as we do as readers of Ellison's novel, taking in the world not as historians do, but with the vessel of imagination handed down and passed along, the prism held up to the light of the black experience that renders visible, audible, cognizable, recognizable all that history, willingly or unwillingly, has learned to forget. And who can this reader be, if not the figure I am pursuing, the black superaddressee? I've written elsewhere about what I call Toni Morrison's black humanism. Now, I will concede that this is a difficult idea to hold. Contested and fraught, I find that it nevertheless seems to crop up all over the place in what Cedric Robinson, in a different register, calls the black radical tradition. It is understandable why that idea, the idea of black humanism, may seem steeped in melancholy. But I want to suggest in my closing reflections here that part of what is distinctive about this tradition is that it encloses within its special mode of address something more, something transformative that tends to cut against a melancholia that is always searching or caught, as it were, and never presumably achieving catharsis. In a beautiful and striking observation, again in None Like Us, Stephen Best, do I have it here? No, I don't have it here, I'm sorry. Stephen Best writes that, quote, Morrison makes separation and fearful estrangement a condition of relation. So kinship appears not a given in the world, but something forged. I love that. Kinship is not a given in the world, but something forged. Something forged is something willed and willfully carried, born, B-O-R-N-E. A thing, I would say, born within Blackness. In his great essay, The Politics of Friendship, Derrida writes, Philia begins with the possibility of survival. Surviving, that is the other name of a mourning whose possibility is never to be awaited because one does not survive without mourning or without bearing mourning, without going into mourning, sans porter le deuil. I feel myself, je me sens in advance et d'avance, before any contract, born to love the other, the dead other, porter à aimer. Perhaps there is within the idea of the Black superaddressee an ethics of reading and also something like a practice or an aesthetic relation, an aesthetic of relation, an impulse to imagine how the other might be born, B-O-R-N-E, along with us and against the tide. And so I'm tempted to modify Best's sentence about Morrison slightly and apply it to thinking about Blackness instead. And I think about the kind of Blackness that the Black superaddressee represents. Because I would venture to say that for Black people, a capaciously construed kinship is a given in the world precisely because it had to be forged and was forged under conditions of abjection and beyond the codes of ethnic and tribal division that have otherwise held such strong appeal to human communities the world over. The conditions of the hold of plantation slavery, and indeed of the afterlife of slavery, required a people who could respond to each other and understand each other as sharing a linked fate and ethical obligation merely because of how they looked and consequently how they would be treated. A people defined by the none like us. The trace, the residuum of this social praxis is all around us today. It is in the air, so to speak. The open and dialogic nature of language, the fluidity of culture, the disproportionate impact of Black music has saturated all of American popular language with its usage. But the fact is that the practice of two people who have no kinship relation, calling, or I would say more precisely, hailing, if you like, interpolating each other as brother or sister in the street, is a practice that emerges from that Black philia and its codes and rituals of sociality, a praxis and poetics that ultimately descends from slavery and the Middle Passage. Perhaps what I'm calling the Black superaddressee then is a point of perspective that encloses or takes as its view this ethics of reading that I'm sort of imputing to it. It's the perspective that I hear in Linda Brent's voice or Harriet Jacobs when, in the closing lines of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, after all the nightmares she has related and the tragic losses incurred, she closes with a sentence that discreetly announces a victory, what Kevin Quashie calls the sovereignty of quiet, that she knows her reader, but also a certain kind of reader in particular, will be able to feel the full measure of. And this is Jacobs. Yet, the retrospection is not altogether without solace. For with those gloomy recollections come tender memories of my good old grandmother, like light fleecy clouds floating over a dark and troubled sea. I hear it too in the prick of conscience in James Weldon Johnson's Pianist, who has decided to pass into whiteness in Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, but who confesses that, quote, I cannot repress the thought that, after all, I have chosen the lesser part, that I have sold my birthright for a mess of pottage. Or, in a different theoretical register, I hear it in that almost mystical injunction proffered by Cedric Robinson in the famous Chapter 7 of Black Marxism, entitled The Nature of the Black Radical Tradition, where he ends by calling for, quote, the continuing development of a collective consciousness informed by the historical struggles for liberation and motivated by the shared sense of obligation to preserve the collective being, the ontological totality. None like us, all us same, the unique and the universal. Two sides of a dialectical coin that requires passage, perhaps from one state to the other. As Orlando Patterson wrote decades ago now, the emergence of freedom seems to have required the experience of slavery. What remains still incompletely available to our thought, what Black Studies, I would argue, is still here to remind us of, or if you like, to remind us of those whom we read and still have to read for, is that it is to the unfree, to the enslaved that one must look, listen, and read in order to understand the meaningful content of that freedom that is yet to come. To read and to listen to the truth that is enclosed in the tradition of the slave, not the compromised architectures of the master. It makes perfect sense to me that in his reflections on the possibility of a truly emancipatory democracy in the politics of friendship, Derrida circles obsessively around the word brother and brotherly and the fraternal. If only he might have listened for those voices that use that enunciation as watchword and password, who have placed its idea at the center of a social praxis and an intellectual project that might well take the title of the Haitian intellectual and anthropologist Antenor Firmin's magnum opus, The Equality of the Human Races. And I'll close here. It is perhaps not unfitting a fate for the Black superaddressee, a rhetorical form of address incubated early on in the abolitionist writings and their yearning for freedom, to have migrated and been digested by the creative efforts of Black fiction and novelistic prose, and to emerge on the far side of the 20th century, loosed upon the common language, spreading everywhere and passing almost into an indifferent oblivion, like Ishmael Reed's Just Grew virus, storming through the roaring 20s and taking over the world with its hoodoo wisdom and infectious rhythms. The debate in Black studies between the humanists and the essentialists, or sometimes call them the pessimists, is not settled and may never be won by either side. But I know for my part, imperfect as the process of getting there may be, that the Black humanistic intuition and its examples, which I've tried to sort of retrieve here from the literary tradition, best describe the world I know I would prefer to live in. Thank you.